AITA for canceling Christmas dinner at my house and locking up the guest room after catching my mother-in-law secretly moving her boyfriend's furniture into my basement. The silence in my kitchen at 3 in the morning has a distinct weight to it. It's the kind of quiet that only exists after a massive storm, the kind where you can still hear the phantom rattling of the windows long after the wind has died down. I sat at the kitchen island, the cold quartz chilling my forearms, staring down the hallway toward the basement door. A heavy padlocked brass latch now sat bolted across the frame, a crude, ugly scar on our beautifully renovated craftsman home. It was a desperate final measure installed just 6 hours ago, a physical barrier against a slow-moving invasion that had been taking over my life for the past 3 weeks. To understand how a 35-year-old woman ends up feeling like a hostage in a home she pays more than half the mortgage for, you have to understand that my mother-in-law, Sylvia, has always mastered the art of the gentle boundary blur. She isn't an overtly aggressive villain. She is a master of the slow creep. She is the kind of woman who sends helpful organizational bins to your house unsolicited, and then arrives a week later to organize your pantry for you, subtly shifting your things until your kitchen no longer feels like yours. For the 7 years I've been married to her son David, I have smiled, swallowed my pride, and adjusted. I chose peace over conflict because I loved David, and because David had lost his father young, leaving him fiercely, almost pathologically protective of his mother's happiness. Then, 4 weeks ago, Sylvia introduced us to Richard. Richard was a smooth-talking, semi-retired consultant from a couple of towns over, whose charm felt like a cheap veneer. Within 2 weeks of dating, Sylvia was talking about him as if he were her soulmate. I kept my reservations to myself, but the alarm bells truly started ringing when Sylvia called David crying, claiming the landlord of her apartment complex was raising her rent by a microscopic percentage, and she felt vulnerable and unsafe staying there. David, acting on the deep-rooted childhood programming that required him to rescue his mother, immediately suggested she stay in our guest room for a few weeks over the holidays. We were hosting Christmas dinner for 20 people from David's extended family anyway, so it seemed logical. She could help with the preparations, settle her nerves, and look for a new place in the new year. I agreed under one strict, explicit condition. She was a temporary guest, and Richard was not to be a permanent fixture in our home. That agreement lasted exactly 48 hours. It started with small things. A pair of Richard's loafers appeared in our mudroom. Then, his favorite brand of dark roast coffee occupied our counter. When I asked Sylvia about it, she gave me a sweet, patronizing pat on the arm. "Oh, Clara, sweetie, he's just spending the night occasionally so I don't get lonely in that big guest bed. Surely you don't mind a little extra romance during the holidays?" But yesterday morning, the slow creep became a full-scale ambush. David was at work, and I had taken our 6-year-old son, Leo, to a holiday matinee movie. We came home early because Leo had developed a sudden mild fever. As I pulled into our driveway, I was blindsided by the sight of a commercial cargo van backed entirely up onto our lawn, inches from our basement egress window. 2 men I had never seen before were carefully maneuvering a massive heavy leather executive desk through our storm doors. Standing on the lawn, directing them like a general, was Richard, wearing one of David's old college football jackets. When I slammed my car door and marched across the grass, my heart hammering against my ribs, Sylvia emerged from the basement stairs, wiping dust from her hands and beaming. "Clara, you're back early," she said, her voice dripping with artificial cheer. "Look at this blessing." Richard's lease ended today, and we realized that instead of him putting his beautiful things into a cold, damp storage unit, your unfinished basement is the perfect size for his home office. We're just going to set up a little sanctuary down here for him. I stood on my own lawn, breathless and dizzy with shock. They weren't just storing boxes. They had already cleared out my seasonal storage, pushed my son's childhood memory trunks into a damp corner, and were actively setting up a permanent, dual living space under my feet. When I looked at Richard and told him to stop unloading the truck, he chuckled, patted the side of the van, and said, "Don't worry, Chief. David and I already talked about the logistics last night. It's all handled." David knew. My husband had quietly signed off on his mother's boyfriend moving his life into our house without a single conversation with me. He had completely erased the map we had built our marriage on to avoid making his mother uncomfortable. When I confronted David on the phone, his voice was pale, defensive, and strained. "Clara, please don't make a scene in front of the neighbors," he pleaded. "My mom was stressed, Richard was stuck, and we have the space. I was going to tell you tonight, I swear. It's just until February. A date pulled out of thin air to pacify me. The weight of that betrayal was suffocating. I spent the afternoon in a state of icy, hyper-focused clarity. I refused to let the movers finish. I locked the basement storm doors from the inside, walked down to the local hardware store while Sylvia and Richard were out to dinner, and bought the heaviest brass latch and padlock I could find. I bolted it to the basement door, locking Richard's desk and half his wardrobe in the dark. Then, I went upstairs, packed Sylvia's suitcases, and set them neatly inside the guest room before locking that door too. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the kitchen floor, I heard the stairs creak behind me. David walked into the kitchen, his hair disheveled, holding 2 coffee mugs. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes dark, but his jaw was set in that stubborn, defensive line I've come to dread. "We need to talk," he said quietly, setting a mug down in front of me. "And you need to be reasonable about the fact that you just locked my mother out of her own living space." The sheer audacity of the word reasonable sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins. I looked up at him, my voice completely devoid of the warmth we had shared for a decade. Reasonable, David. You systematically bypassed our partnership, weaponized your mother's manipulation, and gave away my home. Tell me exactly what part of that requires my cooperation. Before he could answer, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Sylvia sent to the entire extended family group chat, the 20 people scheduled to arrive at my house in 4 days for Christmas dinner. With a broken heart, I have to let everyone know that Christmas dinner at David and Clara's is canceled. Clara has locked my belongings away and made it clear that Richard and I are not welcome in their home. I am currently looking for a motel for the holidays. Please pray for our family during this cold season. The social trap had just snapped shut. David's phone began to vibrate instantly with incoming calls, and I realized with a sinking heart that the war for my own home had just officially begun. The text message burned in my mind for the rest of the morning. I didn't reply to the group chat. A strange, survivalist instinct told me to keep my cards close to my chest, especially now that I realized my husband was no longer operating as my partner, but as his mother's shield. By noon, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from tense silence to an agonizingly performative standoff. David spent the morning pacing the living room, answering frantic phone calls from his aunts and cousins, trying to smooth over the social grenade his mother had detonated. Every time he looked at me, his eyes were full of a punishing, resentful judgment. "Do you see what you've done?" David finally snapped, slamming his phone onto the dining table after a grueling 20-minute call with his Aunt Karen. "The entire family thinks you're a monster, Clara." My aunts are crying. "They think you're throwing a sick, elderly woman onto the street 5 days before Christmas." "She isn't sick, David, and she isn't on the street. She has a fully paid-for apartment until the end of the month," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerous so as not to wake Leo, who was sleeping off his fever upstairs. "And she chose to post that manipulative lie because she knew you would cave under the social pressure. She is testing my compliance, and you are helping her do it." "She's my mother," David yelled, his control finally cracking. "She had a panic attack last night because she feels unwanted." "Richard's lease is over, Clara. Where is he supposed to go?" "Am I supposed to tell my mother that her partner has to sleep in his car during the holidays because my wife is obsessed with boundaries?" "Yes," I countered, standing up to face him, "because this isn't his house. And more importantly, David, you lied to me. You sat across from me at dinner last night, watched me plan the Christmas menu, and never mentioned that you gave a stranger permission to move his furniture into our basement. You violated my trust. How am I supposed to share a life with someone who makes major household decisions behind my back?" Before he could respond, the intercom system on our front porch door chirped. I walked over and looked through the security camera monitor. Sylvia was standing there, wrapped in her pristine wool coat, holding a small overnight bag. Behind her stood Richard, his arms crossed, looking smugly at the camera as if he knew exactly how this play would end. David pushed past me, unlocking the deadbolt and throwing the door wide open. "Mom, come in, please." Sylvia stepped into the foyer, her lower lip trembling beautifully. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes locked on David, her face morphing into a mask of pure, frail tragedy. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry to cause trouble. Richard and I can leave. We found a small, lovely motel by the highway. It smells a bit like damp, but we'll manage. I just don't want to be the reason your wife hates our family." The performance was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. "You're not going to a motel, Mom," David said, his voice thick with emotion as he glared over her shoulder at me. "The guest room is upstairs. I'll get the keys from Clara." "The guest room is locked, Sylvia," I said, stepping into the foyer, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "And it's going to stay locked. You are welcome to stay in your apartment for the holidays, but you are not moving into this house, and Richard's furniture is staying in the basement under lock and key until a professional moving company comes to take it away." Richard stepped forward, his smooth, patronizing demeanor returning. "Look, Clara, let's be reasonable adults here. It's the holidays. We're all family. There's no need to act like a warden over a little bit of storage space." "We are not family, Richard," I replied, my voice as sharp as glass. "You are a man my mother-in-law has known for less than a month, who is currently trying to bypass a lease by using my basement as a free warehouse. You have 5 seconds to step off my porch before I call the police for harassment." Sylvia let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, clutching David's arm as if she might faint. "David! Did you hear how she speaks to us? In your own home." "Clara, stop it!" David shouted, his face flushing red with instant, unvarnished rage. He turned to his mother, his chest heaving. "Mom, take Richard and go get some lunch. Let me handle this. I promise you, you will have a place to sleep tonight." I watched them walk back down the driveway, Sylvia leaning heavily on Richard's arm, though I noticed her step was remarkably steady the moment her back was turned to us. When David slammed the heavy front door shut, the silence that followed felt like the final warning before a structural collapse. He turned around, his eyes cold, dead, and entirely devoid of the man I had married. "Give me the keys to the guest room, Clara," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, terrifying register. "Because if you don't, I'm going to go to the garage, get the crowbar, and break the lock myself. And if I have to do that, this marriage is over." The threat hung in the air like a heavy frost. I looked at my husband, realizing with a sickening clarity that he wasn't bluffing. The little boy who had spent his life shielding his mother from reality had completely taken the wheel, and he was fully prepared to wreck our family to keep her happy. "If you break that lock, David, you aren't just breaking a door frame," I said, my voice shockingly quiet, even to my own ears. "You are telling me that your mother's comfort matters more than my consent. If that's where your line is, then the crowbar is in the green toolbox." I walked away from him, time, heading up the stairs to check on Leo. My hands were shaking, but my mind was remarkably clear. I sat on the edge of my son's bed, smoothing his hair while he slept off the last of his fever, listening intensely for the sound of splintering wood from the hallway below. It never came. Instead, I heard the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut, followed by the roar of David's truck engine reviving in the driveway. He had left. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed, replaced by a cold, survivalist resolve. I needed to know exactly what legal ground I was standing on before the extended family arrived to execute the social execution Sylvia had set in motion. I called an old friend from college, a family and real estate attorney named Rachel. We met 30 minutes later at a quiet coffee shop away from the neighborhood. When I laid out the situation, the joint deed on the house, the metadata of David's secret agreements, and the sudden influx of furniture, Rachel's face grew incredibly grave. Clara, legally, because David is a co-owner, he has the right to invite guests onto the property, Rachel explained, stirring her tea. However, establishing permanent residency or converting an unfinished basement into a commercial workspace without a mutual agreement changes things. If Richard's furniture stays there long enough for him to establish tenancy, or if he starts receiving mail at your address, evicting him could take months and cost thousands, especially during the winter eviction moratoriums. He told me it was handled with David, I whispered, the trap feeling wider and deeper by the second. David gave him permission behind my back. Then David committed joint marital assets and property access without your signature, Rachel said, her eyes locking onto mine. If this environment becomes hostile, you have options. You can file for a partition sale of the home to force a liquidation of the equity, or you can leverage the threat of property division in a legal separation. But Clara, you need to realize what you're fighting. You aren't just fighting an overbearing mother-in-law. You're fighting a husband who is deep in a codependent trauma response cycle. He is willing to sacrifice you to earn the peace his mother never gave him. If you stay in that house, you are going to be subjected to immense psychological warfare over the next few days. I am not leaving my house, I said, each word feeling like stone. I pay 60% of the mortgage, Rachel. I chose the layout, I planted the garden, and my son's life is rooted there. I am not running away to a rental while a man I don't know takes over my basement. I drove back home with a fiery determination. When I pulled into the cul-de-sac, I noticed a strange car parked out front, a silver sedan with out-of-state plates. It wasn't David's truck, and it wasn't the cargo van. I walked into the house through the mudroom, keeping my footsteps quiet. As I passed the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the living room. I paused in the shadow of the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs as I recognized the sharp, nasal tone of David's Aunt Karen, along with Sylvia's reedy whimper. He's completely wrapped around my finger, Karen, Sylvia's voice chuckled, clear as a bell, completely devoid of the trembling, frail sob she had used on my porch hours earlier. David will have that lock off the door by tonight. He's so desperate to make sure I'm taken care of that he'd let me paint the living room pink if I asked him to. Clara thinks she can run this family with her little budget sheets and corporate rules, but she doesn't know who she's dealing with. Just keep playing the motel cards, Sylvia, Aunt Karen replied, her laptop keys clicking rhythmically. I've already primed the rest of the cousins on Facebook. By the time we're done, David will realize she's completely heartless. If she cancels Christmas, we'll just hold it at her house anyway and force her to sit in her room while we celebrate. She won't know what hit her. I stood in the shadow of the hallway, my phone in my hand, the voice memo app quietly recording every single syllable. My hands were steady, but a cold, dangerous clarity washed over me. It wasn't just an influx of an elderly mother. It was a coordinated, hostile family takeover designed to humiliate me into submission in my own home. I waited in the shadow of the hallway until the recording reached 3 minutes, capturing the full blueprint of their little social ambush. Then, I stepped around the corner, my boots clicking loudly on the hardwood floor to announce my presence. The transformation in the living room was instantaneous and seamless. Sylvia dropped her head back against the sofa cushions, her eyes instantly clouding over with theatrical exhaustion, while Aunt Karen slammed her laptop shut, her face morphing from an arrogant smirk into a mask of righteous, defensive indignation. Clara, Aunt Karen said, standing up and crossing her arms, I didn't hear you come in. We were just organizing a place for your mother-in-law to rest since you've decided to turn your own home into a prison. I looked at Karen, then at Sylvia. The sheer sociopathic precision of the act was almost impressive. Karen! I don't recall inviting you to my home today, and last I checked, your name isn't on the deed of this property. Don't you dare take that tone with me, young lady, Karen hissed, stepping forward defensively. Sylvia is a guest in this family, and you are treating her like a criminal. We are trying to salvage Christmas for 20 people because you've decided to have a tantrum over a few pieces of furniture. It's disgusting behavior for a wife. The furniture is an illegal modification of a residential property without the consent of both co-owners, Karen, I said, my voice smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of the anger they wanted to bait out of me. And as for Christmas dinner, let me make this incredibly clear. It is canceled. The locks on the guest room and the basement are staying exactly as they are. If any members of this family show up at my gate on December 25th, they will be met with a private security detail I have hired to enforce a formal trespass notice. Sylvia let out a sharp, breathless gasp, clutching her chest. Karen, oh my heart, she's threatening us. She's going to use security guards on our own family. You are a psycho, Clara, Karen spat, her face flushing a deep, ugly crimson. David will never forgive you for this. We are going to ensure he files for full custody of Leo and strips you of this house. David can speak for himself, I said, gesturing toward the front door. Now, both Both of you have exactly 60 seconds to pack your things and leave my site before I call the local police department to escort you off the premises for unlawful entry and civil harassment. Karen looked at my face, searching for a flinch or a crack in my resolve. Finding none, her eyes darted to the phone in my hand, which was still glowing with the active cloud upload icon. She realized with a sudden spike of panic that I wasn't playing the game by their emotional rules. She grabbed Sylvia's arm, pulling the older woman up from the sofa. "Come on, Sylvia," Karen muttered, her voice shaking with rage. "Let's go find David. We don't need to stay in this house of horrors another minute." I watched them pack their bags and scurry out the front door into the gray afternoon light. The house fell into a deep, hollow quiet. 10 minutes later, David's truck pulled back into the driveway. He walked through the front door, his face pale, holding a heavy crowbar he had retrieved from his office warehouse downtown. He looked broken, his shoulders slouched with the weight of a boy trying to fight a war he didn't understand. He marched straight toward the basement door, raising the iron bar to wedge it into the brass latch I had bolted across the frame. "Before you swing that, David, you should probably listen to this," I said, sitting down at the kitchen island and pressing play on my laptop. Aunt Karen's nasal voice filled the kitchen space, followed closely by Sylvia's clear, mocking chuckle. "He's completely wrapped around my finger, Karen. David will have that lock off the door by tonight. By the time we're done, David will realize she's completely heartless. We'll just hold it at her house anyway and force her to sit in her room." David froze, his arms still raised, the heavy iron crowbar hovering inches from the pristine wood of our doorframe. I watched his face drain of color, his skin turning a sickly, translucent white as his mother's real voice shattered the 30-year illusion he had sacrificed his marriage to protect. The crowbar clattered to the hardwood floor with a deafening metallic crash that echoed through the empty kitchen. David stood paralyzed, his arms still half raised, staring at the laptop screen as if it were a live grenade. The recording played for another 10 seconds, capturing Aunt Karen laughing about how they would force me into my room while they took over our living room for the holidays before I hit pause. The ensuing silence was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. They were joking, Clara," David stammered, his voice cracking, his mind desperately clawing at the walls of the reality he had built his entire life around. She was just venting because she was hurt. She didn't mean it like that." "Stop it, David," I said, my voice cutting through his delusion like a scalpel. "Stop defending the wolves at your own door. She is not hurt. She is not frail. She is an active, malicious architect who is currently using your childhood trauma to dismantle your marriage and take control of your asset. She is bragging about how easy it is to manipulate you." David sank into a kitchen stool, burying his face in his hands. A low, ragged sob escaped his throat, the sound of an adult man realizing that the anchor he had been holding onto his entire life was actually a weight designed to drown him. "She told me she was going to be homeless," he whispered into his palms, his shoulders shaking. "She told me Richard was her last chance at happiness, and that if I didn't help him, I was abandoning her just like my dad did." I felt a profound wave of empathy for him in that moment. He was my husband, and I loved the man he was when his family wasn't breathing down his neck. But as I looked at the padlocked door and thought about the absolute disregard he had shown for my life, my consent, and our son's stability just 24 hours ago, a cold wall of emotional exhaustion rose up inside me. "I am sorry for the pain this causes you, David. Truly," I said, leaning across the counter. "But your mother's validation cannot come at the cost of my sanity or our son's security. They planned a hostile takeover of this house for Christmas. They have weaponized your entire extended family against me on social media. We need to act, and we need to act right now." He looked up, his eyes red, hollow, and completely emptied of the defensive anger he had carried all morning. "What do you want to do?" "We are going to correct the narrative," I said, sliding my phone toward him. "And then we are going to clear out this house." 30 minutes later, David sat at the dining table and opened the family Facebook thread that Aunt Karen and Sylvia had been cultivating all morning. The post already had over 100 comments from aunts, uncles, and distant cousins calling me a heartless monster and advising David to leave her before she ruins your life. David didn't type a long emotional defense. Instead, under my guidance, he uploaded the 3-minute audio recording directly to the comment section, accompanied by a simple, devastating sentence. "This is the reality of what Clara and I were dealing with today. Christmas dinner at our house is officially canceled, and Sylvia and Richard are no longer welcome on our property. Please respect our privacy while we rebuild our marriage." The effect was instantaneous. Within 5 minutes, the frantic typing in the comment thread ceased entirely. The likes and supportive comments began disappearing one by one as the extended family listened to the raw, unvarnished sociopathy of Sylvia and Karen plotting their corporate coup. The illusion of the frail, victimized mother vanished, replaced by a stunned, embarrassed silence from the entire clan. Before the screen could even refresh, the front doorbell rang continuously. I looked at the monitor. Sylvia and Karen were back, their faces twisted into masks of absolute, unbridled fury. They had seen the post. David stood up slowly, the crowbar still lying on the floor behind him. He didn't look like the panicked boy anymore. He looked like a man who had finally decided to protect his own house. He walked to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him to keep them outside in the cold. The commercial moving van returned to our house 4 days after Christmas, on a crisp gray December morning. There were no dramatic arguments, no theatrical tears, and no screams screaming matches on the lawn. Two professional movers, hired and paid for entirely by David's personal account, spent 3 hours hauling Richard's heavy leather executive desk, his filing cabinets, and his wardrobe back out of our basement and into the rear of the vehicle. Sylvia and Richard didn't show up to oversee the removal. They remained inside a small rented townhouse 2 towns over, an asset Sylvia had secretly secured weeks before her eviction crisis, which the court-appointed financial audit of her accounts quickly revealed. She hadn't been facing homelessness. She had simply been looking for a way to live rent-free while leveraging our property equity to fund Richard's consulting business. The social fallout from the extended family was swift and absolute. Aunt Karen deleted her social media accounts within 48 hours of David's post, unable to face the community shame of the leaked audio file. The flying implementation of aunts and cousins ceased entirely, replaced by a quiet, collective withdrawal. We were excluded from the family New Year's party, a penalty that felt less like a punishment and more like a profound, beautiful gift of peace. Our marriage, however, remains in a state of careful, fragile reconstruction. We didn't file for divorce, but the easy, unthinking trust we once shared was a casualty of that week. We started intensive couples therapy the first week of January. In those grueling sessions, I had to voice the hard, ugly truths that I looked at my husband differently now, that I saw him as someone capable of betraying me under the right psychological pressure from his past. David has had to face the painful daily work of mourning a mother who never truly existed, while simultaneously earning back the right to be my partner. We share a bed, but there is an invisible ledger that sits between us, waiting to see if his future actions can balance the debt of his past choices. Leo's fever broke on Christmas morning. We spent the day alone, just the 3 of us, in a quiet, clean house that smelled of pine needles and fresh coffee instead of catering platters and family resentment. Watching him play with his toys on the living room rug, entirely oblivious to the structural war that had just been fought over his head, brought a bittersweet warmth to my chest. Looking back on those chaotic days, I realized that the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves about family is that blood demands the sacrifice of our boundaries and self-worth. For 7 years, I thought being a good wife meant accommodating the slow creep, swallowing my pride and letting my mother-in-law chip away at my sanctuary because it kept the peace for my husband. I learned the hard way that true emotional intelligence requires boundaries that are absolute, unyielding, and ironclad. Canceling Christmas dinner and padlocking that basement door wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. Standing your ground against the people you love is the hardest thing a woman can do. But sometimes, protecting your sanctuary means refusing to let the people who broke their own homes burn yours down just to keep themselves warm. We are surviving. We are rebuilding. But we are doing it on my terms now. And that is the only way forward.